I was living in a friend's garage because my dad kicked me out at the request of his new wife. I moved out. Now my stepmother is asking for help and forgiveness. The phone rang, and it was my stepmother, crying, begging me to save her. She'd stolen my dad's money, lost it all, and now wanted the kid she got kicked out to fix her mess. Years after she ruined my life, her desperation was unreal, and I had the power to walk away. The wedding marked the turning point. Before that, my stepmother kept up her nice act, but once the rings were on, she changed fast. She stopped pretending to care about me or anything that didn't fit her new life with my dad. The house started feeling less like home and more like her territory. She'd walk around with this pinched look on her face, like she was always annoyed about something. Her loud laugh disappeared, replaced by sharp comments she'd throw my way. She'd complain about my shoes by the door, the way I ate, even how long I took in the bathroom. It was constant, little jabs that piled up until I couldn't ignore them. My dad didn't say much at first. He'd just shrug or tell me to let it go. I tried, but it wasn't easy when she was always on my case. She got picky about everything. If I left a plate in the sink, she'd sigh loud enough for the neighbors to hear and mutter about how inconsiderate I was. If I stayed in my room too long, she'd knock and ask why I wasn't helping out more. Nothing I did was right. One day, she looked me dead in the eye and said she'd never want a son like me. That hit hard. I wasn't perfect. Maybe I forgot chores sometimes or played music too loud, but I wasn't a disaster. I got decent grades, stayed out of trouble, and didn't ask for much. In my head, there was no reason for her to hate me that much. It felt personal, like she decided I was the problem before she even knew me. My dad started listening to her more. She'd whisper to him when she thought I couldn't hear, pointing out every little thing I did wrong. He'd nod along, and soon he was repeating her complaints like they were his own ideas. It went from him brushing her off to him siding with her completely. One night, he called me into the living room and said I had to leave. He didn't yell or argue. He just said it was better for everyone if I wasn't around. I could tell it was her doing. She sat there quietly, looking satisfied. I didn't have a job or a plan. I grabbed what I could carry and left. My friend let me crash in his garage, no heat, no privacy, just a concrete floor and a sleeping bag. That's where I landed, thanks to her. It was humiliating, but it lit a fire in me. I wasn't going to stay down forever. Living in my friend's garage was difficult. The first night, I barely slept because it was cold, and I heard every sound outside. The garage was not a home. It was a storage space with old boxes, a rusty lawnmower, and a dim light bulb. My friend was fine with me staying, but his parents were not happy. They allowed it if I stayed quiet and did not eat their food. I had no money, no car, and no plan. My belongings were in a corner, just clothes, a few books, and my old laptop. My dad did not call to see how I was, and I did not think he would. He had picked her over me, and I was no longer part of his life. I started thinking about money a lot. At home, I never had to worry about it because my dad paid for everything. Now, I had nothing, and I needed to solve that quickly. My friend was in a similar situation, working random jobs, so we decided to make money together. We used what we had, a little savings from him, a small amount I collected, and began selling things online. At first, it was slow. We bought cheap electronics and clothes from thrift stores, listed them, and mailed them from his parents' porch. It was hard work, but it kept me from going hungry. I still tried to contact my dad. I sent him texts about where I was staying and how I was managing. He responded sometimes with short messages like, "Glad you're okay," or "Take care." He never said sorry or offered help. I called him once, hoping he would change his mind, but he sounded busy. I heard her talking in the background, and he ended the call fast. I realized he would not support me. He cared about her too much, or he did not want to argue with her about me. I was alone. The business began to grow after a few months, and we earned enough to rent a small apartment. I was not wealthy, but I was not sleeping in a garage anymore. Then she called. After months in the garage, moving into the apartment felt like a win. It was small, just one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with stained carpet, but it was ours. My friend and I split the rent, and for the first time, I had a real bed instead of a sleeping bag on concrete. The business was growing too. We figured out what sold best, used phones, gaming consoles, stuff people wanted cheap, and started making steady money. I handled the listings and shipping while he scouted deals. We worked late most nights, boxes piled up by the door, but it paid off. We weren't rich, but we could eat without worrying about the next bill. I kept busy to avoid thinking about my dad. The apartment was a fresh start, but it didn't erase what happened. I'd see things that reminded me of home, an old car like his in the parking lot, a song he used to play, and it would hit me. He hadn't reached out since I left, not really. Those short texts were all I got, and even those stopped after a while. I wondered if he noticed I was gone or if she kept him too distracted to care. I didn't call him anymore either. It wasn't worth the disappointment of hearing her voice in the background or his rushed excuses to hang up. He'd made his choice clear. The business gave me something to focus on. We upgraded from thrift store finds to buying bulk lots, damaged goods we'd fix up and sell. I learned how to replace phone screens and test circuits, skills I never thought I'd need. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about proving I could survive without them. My friend said I'd changed, gotten tougher. Maybe he was right. Living in the garage had forced me to grow up fast, and now I was someone who could pay rent, buy groceries, and keep the lights on. I didn't need my dad's house or his help. Still, part of me wondered what he thought of me now, if he even knew I was doing okay. The apartment started feeling like a real place. We got a used couch and a small TV, and the clutter of boxes moved to a storage unit we rented as the business grew. Profits went from pocket change to hundreds a month, enough for me to save a little and buy a beat-up bike for getting around. My friend and I split the work and the cash evenly, and it worked. I could pay my share of the rent and eat without stress. The business was solid now, and we even hired a guy part-time to handle shipping. It wasn't a fancy life, but it was mine, built from nothing after everything fell apart. I tried not to think about my dad and her too much, but they crept into my head anyway. Before she came along, my dad and I got along fine, not close like some families, but steady. He'd drive me to school when I missed the bus, ask about my day, fix things around the house while I handed him tools. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Then she showed up, and that changed. She'd interrupt us, pull him away with some excuse, act like I was in the way. I'd catch her rolling her eyes when I talked, or she'd cut me off to tell him something trivial. He started listening to her more, pulling back from me. I'd ask him to hang out, and he'd say he was busy, usually with her. She made it worse after they married. She'd nitpick everything I did, my clothes on the floor, my music, even how I breathed too loud. She'd tell my dad I was lazy, disrespectful, and he'd nod like she was right. I'd argue back sometimes, saying I wasn't that bad, but he'd take her side. The day he kicked me out, she didn't even look sorry, just stood there while he said I had to go. Now, in the apartment, I wondered if he missed me at all. My cousin said they were doing fine, new kitchen, trips, spending his money. She'd won, and I was gone from their world. I stopped texting him after no replies. I had my life now, and it was better without them. My phone buzzed one afternoon, and I saw her name on the screen, my stepmother. I hadn't heard from her in years, not since my dad kicked me out because of her. I hesitated, then answered, and she was already crying hard. Her voice cracked as she said my name over and over, asking me to meet her. She sounded desperate, like she was falling apart. I didn't want to see her, so I told her no. I asked what she wanted, keeping my words short. She kept sobbing, saying I was the only one who could understand her and help her. I didn't get it. She had my dad, their house, the life she'd built after pushing me out. Then she explained. She'd taken a large amount of money from my dad without him knowing. She didn't say how much, just that it was gone, spent, or lost. I couldn't tell. Now she was stuck, and she needed me to fix it. I sat there, holding the phone, unable to process it at first. This was the same woman who'd made my life hell, who'd nitpicked everything I did, who'd told my dad she'd never want a son like me. She'd gotten me thrown out, and now she was begging me to save her. She said she was sorry, that she regretted how she'd treated me, and that she wanted me to come back home. She claimed my dad was furious with her, and she had no one else to turn to. I didn't feel sorry for her. Her apologies didn't erase what she'd done. Every complaint, every time she turned my dad against me, every night I'd spent figuring out how to survive after she got her way. She'd acted like I was nothing, and now she was calling because she'd ruined herself. I told her I wouldn't help. I said she'd made her decisions, and I wasn't going to fix her mistakes. She cried harder, asking me to think about it, but I hung up. The room went quiet. My friend walked in a minute later and asked who it was. I said it was her, and he nodded. He knew the whole story. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling no urge to call back. After I hung up, I sat on the couch with the phone still in my hand. Her voice echoed in my head. Those sobs, the way she kept saying my name like I owed her something. It didn't make sense at first. She'd taken money from my dad, lost it, and now thought I'd be the one to help her. I replayed the call in my mind, trying to figure out how she'd even gotten to that point. She'd always acted so in control, like she had everything figured out when she moved into our house. Back then, she'd rearrange furniture, throw out my mom's old stuff, and tell my dad how to spend his paycheck. Now she was a mess, and I was supposed to care. I thought about my dad too. She said he was mad at her, which meant he'd found out about the money. I wondered how much she'd taken. Hundreds, thousands, maybe more. He'd worked hard for years, kept us comfortable, and she'd just burned through it. Part of me wanted to know if he was okay, but I didn't pick up the phone. He hadn't called me since I left, hadn't checked if I was alive or sleeping on the street. He'd let her push me out, and I'd stopped being his problem. If he was hurting now, it was because of her, not me. I wasn't going to run back and play the good son after all that. Her asking me to come home stuck with me the most. She'd said it so casually, like I could just walk back into that house and pretend nothing happened. That house wasn't mine anymore. It hadn't been since the day my dad told me to leave. She'd made it hers, and I'd built my own life without them. I didn't want her forgiveness or her tears. She'd hated me for no reason, complained about everything I did, and convinced my dad I was the issue. Now she needed me, and it felt like she was just scrambling to save herself. I put the phone down and didn't call back. My friend asked if I was okay, and I said yeah. I meant it. I wasn't shaken, just done. The next few days, I kept thinking about her call. It wasn't guilt. Nothing she said made me feel bad for her. It was more about how strange it felt, her reaching out after years of silence. She'd sounded so weak, nothing like the woman who'd marched into my dad's life and taken over. I remembered how she'd sit at the kitchen table, telling him what to do, acting like she owned the place. She'd criticize me right in front of him, my hair, my grades, how I didn't clean up fast enough. He'd just listen, maybe mumble something to calm her down, but he never stuck up for me. That's how it went until they decided I didn't fit in their picture anymore. I wondered what my dad thought now. She'd said he was angry, probably because she'd blown through his money. I pictured him finding out. Maybe an empty bank account, a bill she couldn't explain. He'd trusted her, built a new life with her, and she'd wrecked it. I didn't feel sorry for him either. He'd chosen her over me. Let her convince him I was the problem. When he told me to leave, he didn't even look me in the eye, just said it was best, and handed me my bag. I'd walked out, and he hadn't called since. If he was mad at her now, it was his mess to deal with. She didn't call again after I hung up. I half expected her to, maybe with more tears or a better story, but the phone stayed quiet. I was fine with that. I didn't want to hear her voice or her excuses. She'd made it clear back then that I wasn't worth keeping around, and I'd survived without them. My life was different now, stable, mine, free of her complaints and his silence. I didn't need to go back to that house or that family. They'd moved on without me, and I'd done the same. My friend asked once more if I'd heard from her, and I said no. He nodded, and we left it at that. A week passed, and neither she nor my dad reached out. I didn't expect them to. Her call had been a fluke, a last-ditch grab for help when she'd hit bottom. I thought about it less as the days went on, and soon it was just another thing that happened. I didn't check my phone for their names anymore. They were part of a past I didn't want back. She'd taken money, lost it, and tried to pull me into her mess, but I'd said no. That was the end of it. I didn't care what happened to her after that, or to my dad. They'd built their life together, and I wasn't in it. I remembered how it used to be, my dad driving me around, joking about dumb stuff, before she showed up. Then she came in, changed him, pushed me out. She'd hated me for no reason, and he'd let her. The day he kicked me out, I'd lost them both. Not just the house, but the family I thought I had. I'd landed in a garage, scraped by, and made something else. They didn't get credit for that. She'd begged me to come back, but it wasn't real. She just needed a way out. My dad hadn't even tried to call, so I knew where he stood. They were on their own now, like I'd been. I stopped talking to them completely. No texts, no calls, no updates through my cousin. I didn't ask about them either. My life was separate, and I kept it that way. The house, the memories, the fights, it all stayed behind me. My friend and I kept going, living our days without their shadow. I didn't hate them, didn't wish them anything bad. I just didn't care anymore. They were strangers now, and I was fine with that. The phone stayed silent, and I never picked it up to change that. That was it. I was done with them for good.